You've heard this story before. Humans learned to farm. Farming gave us wheat. Wheat gave us bread. Bread gave us villages, and villages gave us civilization. Neat, tidy, almost certainly backwards. Here's the thing. The oldest confirmed evidence of humans fermenting grain is older than the oldest confirmed evidence of humans baking it into bread, which means somewhere, roughly 13,000 years ago, so someone was drinking their harvest before they had figured out how to eat it. Ride that again. This isn't a modern joke about priorities. This is archaeology. Picture the scene, a shallow stone bowl tucked into the back of a cave, wild grain soaked and left too long in water that never quite dried out. Nobody's watching it. Nobody's supposed to be watching it. Days pass. It starts to bubble, just slightly, and smells sweeter and sharper than raw grain has any business smelling. Someone crouches down, curious, and tastes it anyway. Slightly reckless. Extremely on brand for a species that also at some point decided pufferfish was worth the risk. In 2018, a team led by archaeologist Li Liu at Stanford University examined stone mortars from Raqefet Cave, a burial site on Mount Carmel in Israel used by the Natufians, a hunter-gatherer culture living roughly 13,000 years ago, right at the hinge point before agriculture existed. Liu's team found starch granules with a very specific kind of damage, the pitting and swelling pattern left behind when starch is soaked, gently warmed, and allowed to sit, not baked, not boiled into porridge, fermented, and on purpose they had made beer. Actual, repeatable, deliberate beer, before farming, before permanent settlements, before, as far as the evidence shows, bread. Liu's team wasn't guessing from a stray stain. They examined residue across several stone mortars carved directly into the cave floor, sunk deep enough that they could hold liquid without leaking, positioned near where the Natufians buried their dead. Whatever this drink was, it wasn't background noise. It was made for something, a burial, a gathering, a ritual worth setting aside grain for. So how does a group of foragers with no yeast culture, no thermometer, and no concept of a microorganism end up brewing alcohol on purpose? Mostly, they didn't do it on purpose. Not the first time. Wild yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the exact species still used in every brewery on the planet today, is everywhere. It's floating in the air. It's living on the husks of the grain itself, waiting for sugar and water to show up so it can get to work. Leave a bowl of wet grain out in a warm cave for a few days and fermentation more or less finds you. Somebody tasted the result. It didn't kill them. It made them feel warm, loose, pleasantly strange, which meant it got made again. Deliberately this time. You don't need a modern understanding of yeast metabolism to notice a pattern. You just need to survive it once, feel good, and remember. This lines up with something biologist Robert Dudley at UC Berkeley calls the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea that primates, us included, evolved a taste for the smell of alcohol because for millions of years it reliably signaled ripe, calorie-dense, overripe fruit lying on the forest floor. Fermented fruit has been feeding fruit-eating animals a low dose of ethanol since long before anyone had a brain big enough to build a fire. We didn't invent the appetite, we just found a way to bottle it. Here's where it gets weirder. The Natufians weren't an isolated case. Around 11,600 years ago at Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone monument complex in southeastern Turkey excavated for decades by archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, researchers found enormous limestone vats, some large enough to hold over 160 liters, coated in residue consistent with fermented grain mash. 160 liters. That's not a homebrew batch. That's a party with a guest list. Göbekli Tepe has no obvious houses. No clear evidence anyone lived there full-time. What it does have is some of the oldest monumental stone architecture on Earth, carved with animals and abstract symbols nobody fully understands, and, quite possibly, industrial-scale beer production sitting right next to it. Which raises an uncomfortable question for the tidy farming, thin-bred version of the story. What if people didn't start settling down, organizing labor, and building monuments because they needed more bread? What if they did it, at least partly, because they wanted more beer, and beer takes planning, storage, and a group of people willing to work a field together for a shared reward waiting at the end? That's the case anthropologists Solomon Katz and Mary Wojtek laid out formally back in 1986 in a paper people are still arguing about today. The beer before bread hypothesis. Their claim wasn't that beer single-handedly invented agriculture. It's messier than that, and more collaborative. Their claim was that fermented grain may have been just as strong a motivator for domesticating wild wheat and barley as the desire for a loaf on the table. Alcohol was calories. It was often safer to drink than untreated water. It killed certain pathogens in the process of fermenting, and it was, from the very beginning, a reason to gather. This wasn't a one-region fluke either. Halfway around the world at the Jiahu Situ site in China, biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania Museum analyzed residue on ancient pottery and identified a fermented drink made from rice honey and hawthorn fruit dating back roughly 9,000 years. Different continent, different grain, different fruit entirely. Same instinct discovered independently, thousands of miles and thousands of years apart. That's not a coincidence. That's a species stumbling into the same shortcut to the same feeling wherever it had the raw ingredients to try. There's also a harder question underneath all of this. Why would a group of foragers, who already had a working tested way of getting calories, bother investing days of waiting around for a jar of fermented grain to become drinkable? Waiting is not free. Waiting means guarding food from animals, from spoilage, from other hungry people, for no guaranteed payoff. Archaeologist Brian Hayden, who has spent decades studying feasting in early societies, has argued that the payoff wasn't nutritional at all. It was social. A feast built around something as unusual and mood-altering as beer was a way to attract labor, cement alliances, and Mark, who was generous enough to be worth following. Nobody organizes a stone hauling crew for Göbekli Tepe with the promise of plain boiled grain. You organize it with the promise of a party at the end. So the sequence Hayden proposes looks less like farming, then bread, then eventually beer as a treat, and more like surplus grain, an accidental ferment, a good feeling, a reason to gather, and then, only afterward, enough motivation to start deliberately planting and tending grain to make sure the next batch wasn't left to chance. And it isn't only a story locked away in the archaeological record. Traditional brewing survived structurally unchanged into the present in communities all over the world. Andean Chicha, made by chewing and spitting maize, so enzymes in human saliva break down the starch into fermentable sugar, or sorghum beers brewed communally across parts of sub-Saharan Africa, shared out of the same pot at gatherings where the brewing itself is the social event, not a byproduct of one. The method changed, the reason for doing it barely did. So no, beer wasn't a fun side effect of farming. There's a real, still debated argument that farming was, in part, a side effect of beer. Here's what nobody tells you about the civilization was built on bread version of events. Bread requires an oven, careful timing, and it doesn't keep for long once it's baked. Beer is far more forgiving. Leave the mash alone, mostly, and the yeast does the labor for you over days instead of hours. For people transitioning out of a hunting-gathering life, brewing may have been the easier win, and a shared jar of it was a reason to stop, gather, and celebrate a harvest with something better than a handshake. Which brings us to the part where none of this is actually ancient history. We still do this. A wedding without a toast feels unfinished. A promotion gets marked with a round of drinks, not a loaf of sourdough. An office happy hour exists because someone 10,000 years after Göbekli Tepe still understood that shared fermentation builds a group faster than shared carbohydrates ever could. We didn't outgrow the instinct. We just moved it from a 160-liter limestone vat to a plastic cup with someone's name misspelled on it. And here's the part that should needle you a little. The same appetite that built one of the earliest known feasting sites on the planet is the same appetite currently driving a multi-billion-dollar industry of seltzers, IPAs, and $9 canned cocktails with names like a failed startup. We like to believe we've evolved past our impulses. Mostly, we've just packaged them better. So the next time someone insists that agriculture came first and everything else followed right from it, you can tell them it's more complicated than that. Somewhere in a cave on Mount Carmel, or beside a stone vat in southeastern Turkey, big enough to drown in, a group of people who hadn't invented the wheel yet had already figured out how to throw a party. They just needed a reason to stick around for round 2.